Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most massive, dramatic economic experiments in human history. We're going to explore how an enormous nation tried to run its entire economy without free markets. We're tracking the 70-year arc of the Soviet Union, and as you'll see, it's a story of a giant economic pendulum swinging wildly back and forth between strict state control and desperate market reforms.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, Lenin's mixed economy. 2. The 5-year plans. 3. Agriculture and human cost. 4. Shortages in the black market. And 5. Perestroika and the collapse.
All right, Section 1, Lenin's mixed economy. So, picture the early 1920s. The Bolsheviks quickly realized their initial policies of forced requisitioning, literally taking grain directly from peasants, had caused agricultural production to absolutely plummet. The economy was completely stalling out. To fix this, Vladimir Lenin introduced the New Economic Policy, or NEP, in 1921. Now, this might seem incredibly surprising for a brand new communist state, but it essentially rolled back complete state control. It allowed private individuals to own small businesses and let farmers sell their surplus grain for a profit. The state kept its grip on what Lenin called the commanding heights, stuff like heavy industry, banks, and foreign trade, but they let a mixed economy flourish right underneath it.
This really highlights Lenin's pragmatism. Many of the hardline Bolsheviks absolutely hated the NEP, seeing it as a total betrayal of the revolution. But Lenin? He viewed this temporary state capitalism as taking one step backward to take 2 steps forward later on. He knew the country desperately needed to build up its material wealth and recover from years of war before it could ever hope to achieve true communism.
And that brings us to the rise of the netmen. These were a brand new class of private business folks who swooped in to fill the economic gaps the state just couldn't handle. Get this, by 1922, these netmen controlled almost 75% of all Soviet retail trade. They literally rescued the retail economy. But, as you can probably guess, they became intensely reviled by communist hardliners who stereotyped them as vulgar and greedy, slapping them with massive taxes and even stripping them of their voting rights.
Moving on to Section 2, the 5-year plans.
After Lenin passes away, Joseph Stalin consolidates power, and by 1928, that economic pendulum swings drastically back toward total state control. He ends the NEP, outlaws private commerce, and hands the keys to Gosplan. Imagine a massive, central bureaucracy tasked with planning every single economic detail for a continent-spanning country. Instead of the natural forces of market supply and demand, Gosplan defined the exact inputs of raw materials, dictated factory schedules, and literally set all wholesale and retail prices in these massive 5-year chunks. It was a staggering logistical undertaking.
The crucial takeaway here is the total night-and-day contrast between these two eras. The NEP was decentralized and relied on everyday personal incentives to get things moving, but Stalin's first 5-year plan completely flipped the script. We are talking massive state-owned industry, forced collectivization of farms, and incredibly strict top-down production quotas. The singular obsession was rapid, heavy industrialization.
Now, why the sudden, drastic rush? Well, this heavy-handed central planning was fueled by a deep, existential paranoia of the capitalist world outside. Stalin laid it out pretty bluntly, warning that if the Soviet Union didn't end its economic backwardness, the advanced countries would crush them. There was this urgent, driving need to build a massive industrial base to prepare for future wars.
And from a purely macroeconomic, bird's-eye view, it actually achieved its primary goal. From 1950 to 1965, this brute force industrialization successfully doubled the Soviet GDP. Sure, they still trailed the United States, but they cemented their position as the world's second-largest economy for decades, completely outpacing the total output of nations like Japan at the time.
But, and this is a massive but, this macro-level triumph begs a very important question about the daily lives of actual Soviet citizens. If the overall GDP is doubling, and they're the #2 economy on Earth, why were basic consumer goods like shoes, carpets, and just decent food so incredibly hard to find? That takes us to Section 3, Agriculture and Human Cost.
To figure out where all the consumer goods went, we have to look away from the macroeconomic data and focus on the micro-level miseries, starting with the farms. During the first 5-year plan in the 1930s, peasant property was effectively liquidated. The government ripped up the small family farms of the NEP era and replaced traditional farming with a highly rigid, state-controlled collective system. Agriculture was now organized into massive state farms called sovkhozes and collective farms called kolkhozes.
The immediate human cost of this forced shift was horrific. Wealthier farmers, known as kulaks, were labeled class enemies and deported by the millions. And the peasants who stayed? Many chose to slaughter their own livestock in protest rather than hand them over to the state, literally halving the number of working animals. This brutal disruption directly contributed to a massive famine from 1932 to 1933, including the Holodomor in Ukraine, which claimed anywhere between 5.7 and 8.7 million lives. Beyond the immediate tragedy, it locked the entire agricultural sector into chronic, systemic inefficiency for decades to come.
Let me put a number on just how broken that system became, $152 billion. Because the top-down collective farming system was so fundamentally inefficient, the Soviet Union, a nation with incredibly vast fertile lands, had to spend a staggering $152 billion on foreign food imports between 1961 and 1985 just to keep its people fed.
Which naturally leads us into Section 4, shortages and the black market.
This inability to meet basic consumer demands didn't just stop at food, it pushed the whole system into an era of deep stagnation. As the Soviet economy grew more advanced, the sheer math of Gauss plans simply couldn't keep up with reality. I mean, planning steel production for a wartime economy is one thing, but planning the shifting consumer demand for thousands of everyday household items? It's impossible. So to avoid being punished for missing wildly unrealistic targets, factory managers and bureaucrats just started faking their reports. They routinely falsified data just to look successful on paper, which deeply entrenched the economic crisis.
And for ordinary people, the reality was grim. While the state is churning out world-class space rockets and military technology, planners completely neglected basic household goods. Consumers routinely stood in queues for hours just to buy toilet paper or basic foods. Unsurprisingly, a massive black market exploded for sought-after goods. Citizens basically had to survive through complex social networks of favors, often called blat, trading access to scarce goods purely through personal connections.
By the early 1990s, this structural imbalance is just glaringly obvious. The consumer sector accounted for only 60% of the GDP, with agriculture and heavy industry eating up massively disproportionate chunks. It reveals a deeply distorted economy, a bloated industrial sector, while agriculture and consumer goods were struggling just to provide the basic quality of life expected in a developed nation.
And that brings us to our final chapter, Section 5, Perestroika and the Collapse.
Enter Mikhail Gorbachev. He takes power in 1985 and initiates a policy known as Perestroika, which literally means restructuring, in a desperate attempt to save this ailing system. He was frantically trying to swing that pendulum back toward Lenin's NEP. In 1987 and 1988, he actually passed laws allowing factories to make their own decisions and officially permitted private ownership of businesses for the first time since the 1920s. He hoped this gradual return to a mixed economy would spark growth, but instead, ripping out the central command structure without actually implementing full market pricing just accelerated the whole system's unraveling.
The sources actually provide a really fascinating comparison here. When you stack it up against China's successful market reforms of the same era, the Soviet approach was just far too hesitant. Soviet perestroika was gradualist. They kept price controls and government monopolies in place, which honestly just created fiscal anarchy. Chinese reform, on the other hand, was a bottom-up approach that immediately freed up agriculture and light industry. The Soviet half measures just created brand new bottlenecks without ever truly fixing the old ones.
The end result was totally catastrophic for the state. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed entirely. It bequeathed its successor, the new Russian Federation, a massive $66 billion in external debt and virtually zero gold or foreign exchange reserves. The economic engine had completely, utterly seized up.
So, looking back at this wild 70-year economic pendulum swing, from the mixed markets of the NEP to the iron grip of Stalin's 5-year plans, and finally to the panicked reforms of perestroika, it leaves us with one incredibly provocative historical puzzle. Can a system built entirely on rigid state control ever successfully liberalize itself without triggering its own total collapse? It's a question economists and historians are literally still debating today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the structures around you.